Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And today I have a very special guest, a repeat guest, because I had him on my podcast previously in a 2-episode interview. It was so in-depth and important. I'll get back to that in a minute. I have with me Craig Unger, a New York Times best-selling author of 6 books on the Republican Party's assault on democracy, including The House of Bush, The House of Saud, The House of Trump, The House of Putin, and American Compromat, which is the red book behind your ear, Craig, that I had you and former KGB official Yuri Shvets on my podcast, and we've talked a lot about the recruitment of Donald Trump into the spy ring of the Soviet Union. But I just finished reading your latest book called Den of Spies, subtitle Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House. And we're going to get into it, but man, for me, having been in the Moonies and learning about how the CIA set up the Korean CIA and they used the Moonies and the whole Republican, Washington Times network, for me, the Den of Spies kind of blew my mind, but in a good way, because it connected a lot of the dots. But before I ask you to start speaking, I just want to tell my listeners, you went to Harvard, you were an undergraduate editor at the Harvard Crimson, moved to France, you were co-owner, editor of the Paris Metro, a celebrated biweekly English language city magazine in the French capital, served as a staff writer for the New York Magazine for many years, contributing editor for Vanity Fair. I can go on and on. Your work has been in the New Republic, Washington Post, Guardian, New Yorker. I'm honored to get to know you and have you on the Influence Continuum, Craig Unger.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's assume people have not read any of your books before. Let's dive into the new one because we want people to pick it up and read it and talk about it, because the media, as we know, is not really fair anymore, especially social media. And I know you got banned on Twitter. We can talk about censorship by Elon Musk, but let's give the thesis of the new book. Let's get into that first, and we can circle around to the...
Well, this is a bit different from some of my other books in one sense, in that it's personal. And it's personal because I had a front row seat at what was going on. And I was a very reluctant onlooker and sometimes participant in seeing it being covered up when I was at Newsweek magazine back in 1991. And so this has been a journey of 33 years trying to put together exactly what happened. Bits and pieces have come out in the press over the years, but I think no one has shown exactly how the great master spy, Bill Casey, who later became head of the CIA, put together a secret intelligence network when he was a private citizen and orchestrated a covert operation, a treasonous covert operation, in my mind, that sabotaged an American presidential election and installed Ronald Reagan rather than Jimmy Carter in the 1980.
So that's maybe why I identified with your book so strongly, because I have a 48-year narrative thing, and along the way I've learned things. Robert Parry interacted with me. You reference him as a source of intel for you. He interviewed me about the Iran-Contra, Oliver North, Washington Times connection. But just this whole thing, I want to tell my listeners that Casey was in the OSS, a student of Wild Bill Donovan. So maybe we can start with the spycraft, history a little bit. Or maybe you have another angle.
No, that's perfectly good. Casey to me is a fabulous character. I characterize him as really a mix between James Bond and Mr. Magoo. And he was the kind of guy who spat when he talked. His table manners were atrocious. He very much wanted to be Secretary of State under Reagan. Nancy Reagan would not have it. She couldn't imagine him at state dinners dribbling food into his cummerbund and all that. He when he got anxious, he would chew on his necktie. He would be going in a dozen different directions at once, and no one put it all together. But in the end, he was a brilliant spy. He started off, as you said, in World War II in the Office of Strategic Services under Wild Bill Donovan. This was the precursor of the CIA, and he did absolutely brilliant work against the Nazis after the invasion of Normandy, D-Day. Where were our soldiers going to go? What were the strategic targets? Could they get behind German lines and get double agents there? All that. And he was terrific then. Sadly, I think he used some of his brilliant tactics against the Democrats in later life. And he never really stopped being a spy. I mean, most people saw him as a lawyer for the 35 years after World War II, but he had a secret network going. And to me, I think my greatest accomplishments in this book was reconstituting that secret network he put together and seeing how he used it against Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, so I just want to say I think James Bond and Mr. Magoo is just so funny characterization, and but I'm sure right on. And I also want to just comment that, oh, what can I say? The essence of spycraft is deception, and misdirection and sowing disinformation and misinformation and using journalists and, just creating all kinds of ways to cover tracks. And people have been trying to figure out the October surprise is what I learned it was called, the October surprise before the election. That Casey did a deal with the Iranian regime to sell arms to keep the hostages from being released because it would have helped Jimmy Carter get reelected. And
right, absolutely. He was a master illusionist, and part of it was making you not see what was there in plain sight. And The Onion, the satirical magazine, had a end of the century, a look back at the 20th century book. And for the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, they had a fake headline reading, Ronald Reagan inaugurated, urges America not to put two and two together. And the reason for that was the hostages were released while Reagan was still on the podium taking the oath of office. So he could not possibly have negotiated it, and they could not possibly have released them without having some contact with Reagan's team. So there had to be behind the scenes contacts, but somehow they got away with it. And I mean, what I set out to do was to show exactly how that happened.
Yeah, and let me just say for our younger listeners or those who don't remember the hostage crisis when the Khomeini government overthrew the Shah, it was on nightly news. Another day, the hostages, the embassy officials were captive. So it was drilled into the American consciousness, and that Jimmy Carter was looked at as a not an efficient president by, protecting them from initially getting captured, but also not getting them released, right? And then you also document the ineffective attempt to rescue them in your book.
Right. I mean, there was actually a ABC News had a show set up day after day and ended. America held hostages day 99, day 100, 101. This went on for 444 days, 52 American hostages. And what was sort of staggering and unbelievable was that Casey's operation as campaign manager for Ronald Reagan, his covert operation was first they had to, Iran had become our adversary, a hostile foreign power. So there was an arms embargo against them, and Casey secretly managed to violate the arms embargo and ship millions and millions of dollars worth of weapons to Iran, again, without getting caught. But in return for that, he wanted one thing from Iran, and that was he wanted them not to release the hostages immediately, but to hold them until after the 1980 presidential election.
So he was a private citizen. He was made a campaign manager for Reagan. Where did he get access to all of these arms?
Well, as I found out, I went to Israel and to Iran. And when I got to Israel, I interviewed Yehoshua Sagi, who was director of Israeli military intelligence. And he said almost off the cuff, oh, I was meeting with Casey in 1979, 1980. And I thought, wait a minute. He was a private citizen then.
Right.
And the Iran revolution was going on full blast. It was by far the most important. It was a truly historic event in the Middle East. It completely changed the balance of power there. Iran, of course, is a source of a huge amount of oil, but it also had real geostrategic significance and was an ally of both Israel and the United States. And suddenly it flip-flopped. So Casey was very much on top of that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I kind of forgot that, but your book reminded me that Iraq was Sunni, Iran was Shiite. They have their own conflicts over who's the heir to Islam, and there was a kind of a balance of power in a way. But the notion for me, reading your book about Israelis getting arms to Iran boggles my mind, especially we see the war happening now.
Well, absolutely. And it's important to understand. Let me just say one sentence. Israel was an active partner in a covert operation that sabotaged an American presidential election. They're supposed to be our allies. They're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to respect our sovereignty. And just saying what I said was taboo. And no one wanted it reported, Israel most of all, but a lot of neoconservative politicians and Republicans here as well. It's worth reminding, again, your younger listeners may not know it, but at the time, the revolutionaries, the winning in Iran, were chanting in the streets, "Death to America." They called America the Great Satan. Israel was the little Satan. And here there was a secret alliance behind the scenes that just would have blown people's minds if you were reading the daily papers in those years.
It blows my mind now just to think about what was going on back then and just how much manipulation there is of information and news. And I really like your analogy about illusionists and magicians, and they want you to look here because they're doing something with their other hands.
Right. When the magician says, "Follow my hand," don't. He's misdirecting you, and Bill Casey was brilliant at that.
Right. So I don't know. Jimmy Carter's 100 years old. He just voted for Kamala Harris, when early elections in Georgia happened, happily, he said. But he was like an ethical Christian guy.
He really was. And he was a Christian evangelical of a type that is very, very, very different from what we see today. I mean, it's hard to imagine a liberal American president who was a Christian evangelical, but that's what he was. And sadly, most Christian evangelicals have gone into a very different direction.
Yeah, as I wrote in my book, The Cult of Trump, and about the New Apostolic Reformation. But having said that, I just interviewed Amanda Tyler, who's a Baptist, who's a lawyer, and she just wrote a book, How to End Christian Nationalism, and is saying we need a separation of church and state, and, is just being like commonsensical and sane and supporting the Constitution. So there are some good Christians out there that are doing and saying the right things.
Absolutely. The thing with Carter is, he was so unfairly treated, I think, as he was, what the Republicans did allowed him to be portrayed as this weak, feeble president who allowed America to be humiliated, when in fact he was sabotaged by the Republicans by a treason and a act. I think this was a violation. I'm not a lawyer, but it was likely a violation of the Logan Act, which prohibits private citizens from hijacking American foreign policy. And in this case, the Republicans, of course, were doing it for their own ends. It was party over country, party over country. And I think it foreshadows a lot of what we're going through today.
Yes, and the end of your book, Den of Spies, I don't remember if it was the appendix or what, but you summarize decades of bad acting. I can only say it that way, of the GOP, and a lot of people still talk about Reagan as a great guy and everything, but when one reads the Den of Spies, one realizes he got into power with a massive illegal deception and maneuver.
Absolutely. He was, to put it in perspective, I think I go back to 1980, but I can actually go back farther to 1968. And in that election, you had Richard Nixon running against Hubert Humphrey. President Johnson was trying to end the Vietnam War. But he had a peace conference going on in Paris. And at the last minute, again, in October, Nixon sort of pulled his version of the October surprise, and he got an intermediary, a woman named Anna Chennault, to convince the South Vietnamese not to go to the peace table, to withdraw from the peace talks. So the Democrats looked like they had egg on their face. It didn't end the Vietnam War. It continued another 5 or 6 years under Nixon. And Nixon squeaked by in the election with a small majority.
And just to remind my listeners, Roger Stone worked with Richard Nixon, even has a tattoo, I believe, on his back of Richard Nixon to this day. Bad actor.
It's a huge tattoo of Nixon's face on his back. It was published in the New Yorker. And these things have been going on and on for years. I just told you the story of 1968. But Nixon was worried that the Democrats had the goods on him, and they had various tapes and documents. And when he started running for re-election in 1972, he wanted to get those documents and tapes. So he put together a small group of burglars, and they broke into the Brookings Institute and office residential complex known as the Watergate. Mm-hmm. So that was the Watergate scandal. So you have 68, you have 1972, you have 1980. Roger Stone, you mentioned, in 2000, he led the Brooks Brothers riots in Miami that interfered with the counting of the votes.
That was with Gore.
That was Gore, exactly. And so it went to a Republican-dominated Supreme Court to win that, who decided that election. And then we come up to Trump in 2016, which I write about as well in 2 books. So it's happened again and again. Initially, I think it was very covert, as I show in this book. Everything was behind the scenes. With Trump today, it's almost overt. Back in 2016, he said, Russia, if you're listening, get me those emails.
I remember that, of course.
And of course, one of his surrogates today is Elon Musk, who is doing a lot of work and has a lot of Russian money with him as
Yeah, the
well.
Wall Street Journal actually did an article, citing Musk and the relationship with Russia. But I need to come back to our two-parter that I did with you for American Compromat and Yuri Shvets, which blew my mind then. Because Yuri, I'm going to do a bad characterization, but Yuri said, this is my memory. I was much higher up than Vladimir, and the Soviet Union. We recruited American businessmen. Of course, we recruited Donald Trump a long time ago, and he cited the place in New York City, and that's why for me it's an old story, and why I put in the Cult of Trump Russia as the main puppet master of Donald Trump in chapter 7.
Right. Yuri was a classmate of Putin's, and he did much better in school, and he got much higher within the KGB than Putin did. And so during the mid 80s, he was actually stationed in Washington, recruiting Americans to join, to be assets for the KGB, while his colleagues in New York Station were recruiting a guy named Donald Trump. And it started back in 1980. Trump had just done his first and perhaps his only really, really successful project. It's the Grand Hyatt Hotel, still right next to Grand Central Station. And like every hotel, it needed some TV sets, lots of TV sets. And he ended up buying them from a little electronics store that was actually a front for the KGB. And they made him an offer he couldn't refuse, cheap TVs, and they started flattering him, and that's how they began cultivating him. At the time, the United Nations Library, the Russians who worked there were all really spies, intelligence agents, and they started taking Trump to lunch, and they flattered him, and they told him they were so impressed by Trump Tower that they wanted to do one in Moscow. And if you think about it, and if you know anything about the Cold War, just wait a minute. They were hardened communists, and they want a monument of conspicuous consumption, a monument to American capitalism in Red Square. That makes no sense whatsoever. But Trump was susceptible to flattery,
Yeah,
to
he's a
say the least.
narcissist. Yeah, of course. A malignant
Absolutely.
narcissist. They know how to play people. They have whole profiles on people, right?
And if you read the KGB handbooks, that's what they go for when they're looking for assets.
Yeah, and they also like to use pretty Russian women agents to seduce and blackmail Americans and other people, right? I mean, that's standard operating spycraft.
And if you know anything about Donald Trump, I think it's fair to say he would be susceptible to that.
Yeah, so he was recruited before Ivana, his marriage to Ivana, or
right. Well, it may have been separate, but it's hard to say if Trump knew what he was doing. I mean, you can see him just. It's also worthwhile distinguishing an asset from an agent. An agent is knowing. He knows he's effectively signed a contract with the KGB or the CIA or whatever, and he is given specific tasks, and he gets a paycheck. Assets do favors. They do him a favor. He it's a system of favors, and it's like a favor bank, and Trump has paid them back many times over.
Yeah, and they rescued him many times over with his gambling casinos.
Absolutely.
Real estate and everything. May I just go back for a minute to connect some personal dots with your understanding? So I was recruited at Queens College in 1974, February, after a girlfriend dumped me. And I became a right-wing true believer in Moon and the Messiah and taking over the government, and democracy was satanic, and was sent to fast for Nixon, even though I hated Nixon beforehand and protested against the Vietnam War. And and Moon just said, we have to infiltrate the government. We have to end this satanic stuff, and when we take power, we'll amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense if people don't do what we tell them to do. And I thought it was a great idea because I was totally brainwashed at the time. Anyway, I got out through a deprogramming, as you know. But in the years after I learned about the Manchurian Candidate, the Cold War mind control research, Jonestown happened and the assassination of Leo Ryan. And I wanted to move to DC in 1980 to do an ex-member nonprofit. And when Reagan came in, the Moonies got the Washington Times. So I just want to comment that from the beginning, the Moonies, were sent to Washington, D.C. They had a whole media empire, TV broadcast facilities in 1980. I didn't learn till later the Council for National Policy, which is a right-wing think tank, installed James Whelan as the founding editor of the Washington Times.
Right.
And there was Ronald Reagan holding up the Washington Times, his favorite newspaper. He read first thing every morning, and every Republican president since. So I just wanted to insert my life story and the Moonies into this story.
Right. Well, the timing is interesting in that if you look at the CIA after World War II, they were doing one coup d'etat after another. They did one in Syria. In Iran in 1953, they installed the Shah, and it was hugely important. And it's really what led up a generation later to the October Spies in 1980. But they also overthrew governments in the Dominican Republic and Vietnam and so forth. In the mid-70s, there was a huge crackdown on the CIA, and they started looking for more covert ways of doing things. And
that was the Church Committee you're referring to?
Exactly. No, yes, it was Frank Church and in the Senate, the Pike Committee in the House of Representatives. Seymour Hersh wrote about the family jewels. All the secrets came out, and they had to sort of reconstitute themselves and have much more discreet, covert operations. So it seems to me as if the Mooney operation was makes sense coming after that crackdown.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about Carter like firing 800 CIA people who were pissed off and out of work and ready to do contract work for whoever wanted to keep using them.
The CIA hated Carter. They really did. His Naval Academy buddy, Stansfield Turner, Carter had installed as head of the CIA. There was a huge clash of cultures, and in the operations directorate alone, Turner fired 800 people, and a lot of them started working against Carter. And there were leaks in the National Security Council. I talked to Carter's personal secretary, a woman named Susan Clow, and she, there were huge leaks and from the White House, and it made it very difficult for Carter to get the hostages back.
Yeah, and there was a whole helicopter rescue effort that sounded like it got sabotaged.
Right. In April, after 4 or 5 months of negotiating with Iran and getting nowhere, Carter effectively was giving up, and he said, gee, he really didn't want to invade Iran airspace because he was scared of starting off a big war, but there was no other choice. So he put it together. It was being done very, very secretly, but it's clear it was leaking out to the Republicans, to Casey's team. Bill Casey had spies within the Carter administration, and there's a lot of reason to believe it was sabotaged. I don't think it's conclusive, but among other things, I was able to get an unpublished memoir of a Palestinian intelligence operative named Mustafa Zain. And he was the top intelligence chief reporting to Yasser Arafat. in the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Mm-hmm.
And the CIA was working for Carter in a way, trying to get him to and Arafat to negotiate with Iran and help bring home the hostages. And Casey's team found out about it and they thwarted it.
Mm-hmm. So, I just want to say again, because I introduced you, like, to my listeners, like, Craig Unger is a journalist, an investigative journalist. He's like really solid, established. He does his homework. He doesn't overstate things. He wants to, make sure his editors and the lawyers are going to vet everything. All this stuff is vetted. This is not hyperbole or just like a political attack job or something.
Yeah.
This is the real stuff,
Right.
people.
All my books have roughly 1,000 footnotes, so you can check it out and go to the original source in most cases.
Yeah. So I'm really grateful to you. And I don't know where to go next in this. It was a fascinating read, and I think the fact that it was a story with common sense, as you said. How could Reagan have gotten the hostages released the day he's inaugurated if there wasn't something done earlier than that, right? The common sense thing. But actually interviewing key people and putting the times and places and knowing that Casey was in Madrid, even though they said he wasn't, and Bush Sr. Let's talk about Bush Sr. too, please.
Right. Well, Bush Sr., of course, had been head of the CIA. So, and he and Casey were very, very different types of people. Bush Sr. was sort of very patrician, genteel, understated. He was a gentleman. He was polite. He didn't spit when he talked or any of that
he
stuff.
Didn't chew his tie
right.
either.
Casey was from a sort of lace curtain Irish family. He, and there was sort of a culture clash between them, but they worked together. I mean, I think they had an understanding, and there was quite a few sources said that Bush participated in meetings with Iran that took place in Paris. I don't think it's 100% turned down, and I checked out, and I'm sort of agnostic in terms of whether or not that took place. But it's hard to believe Bush didn't have a role in this.
Right. I'm just going to grab a book off my shelf. Because when I left the Moonies, I was a whistleblower for a congressional subcommittee investigation into Koreagate. And Robert Betcher was the staff director of this. And so at the time, I was afraid of being assassinated. And I just said, like, I'll be back, interview me privately. Don't put me on, don't put me publicly, please. Anyway, Bob said Bush Sr. did everything possible to undermine the investigation.
Well, I'm not surprised at all because, he was president when I started investigating this back in 1991, and he was running for re-election. And part of the impetus for the investigation was this. To me, this was like Watergate in a way. You have a sitting president that's being investigated. Was he part of the October surprise or not? That's the kind of thing that would essentially flip-flop an election. I mean, but unlike Watergate, this thing got really covered up. And to me, that was one of the most distressing parts of it. Was I was investigating this for Newsweek, and I thought we were really going after it. Newsweek back then was owned by the Washington Post company. It was some years after Watergate, but the whole company still had a sort of an aura around it because it had done this terrific investigative reporting. But when I got to Newsweek, to my astonishment, they did a 180 and they started killing the whole investigation and did stories that tried to discredit all the key sources rather than pursuing the people who really did it. And it was sort of astonishing to me because Newsweek ended up doing 3 stories in a row saying the October surprise didn't happen, it didn't happen, it didn't happen. And if you know anything about the news business, news is when something happens. When something doesn't happen, that's not news. But there they went at it, and they proceeded to try to destroy it. I was also sued by Bud McFarlane, who was Reagan's national security advisor. Anyone who went after it, we had our careers just destroyed, at least for a few years. And it wasn't until many years later that Bob Perry, my colleague, actually found a memo that was in the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in Texas A&M in College Station, Texas. And it was very short sentence. And it was from the State Department when Bush was president. And it said, Casey was in Madrid in July 1980 for purposes unknown. And that kind of sealed the deal in a certain way. And it was clearly suppressed by the Bush administration. And all the people who were trying to deny the October surprise put together one phony alibi after another for Casey. And he really was in Madrid. And I think that was sealed 100% by Bob Perry. And then I went on and sort of mapped out everything Casey had done. And I actually ended up getting the receipts, as it were, that is, invoices for weapons that were sent from Bill Casey's operatives, and their names are on the invoices. And these were 4 spare parts for C-130 cargo planes. And they went straight to the president of Iran, who turned them over to me and to the House of Representatives, which did nothing with them, really. And their whole investigation was a whitewash.
And needless to say, you've spent thousands and thousands of hours scouring documents, flying all over the world to interview sources and back-checking sources. I mean, it was exhausting in a way, reading your book. Like, how, 33 years you've been on this story.
Yeah, I have done other things in the meantime. But it was something I didn't want to let go of. And the reason is, this is a dark, dark chapter in American history. And I think that's part of the problem, is America doesn't want to acknowledge its really dark parts. And I in the end, I talk about, there was a book called Learning from Germany by Susan Neiman. She's a Jewish woman who lived in Berlin. And one of the key points she makes is that growing up living in Germany, Germans acknowledge that they committed these atrocities. One of the former presidents of Germany said, the only way to love Germany is with a broken heart. As for myself, I remember when I was a kid, I took my first trip to Europe when I was about, I think, in 8th grade. And my father took me to Dachau. And I happen to be Jewish, very secular. But when you get to Dachau, it is a chilling experience. And you realize that the buildings are very, there's nothing about them that's interesting except for one fact. And that is they were built with one purpose, and that was to murder thousands and thousands of people. And Germany acknowledges that. And when I got back from that trip, I was in 8th grade at the time, I went back to school and we went on a Texas history trip. I lived in Dallas at the time.
Right.
So we went to the Alamo. And there we sort of cheered for Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and so forth and all that. And it wasn't.
I grew up in that era too, the TV show Davy Crockett.
Absolutely,
I can still hear the song in my head.
I had a Davy Crockett lunch box and all that stuff. And they were
Right.
American heroes, rugged frontiersmen, sort of,
Right.
with a coonskin cap. Every kid had a coonskin cap. That wasn't the real story. The real story was that Texas at the time was a province in Mexico. Mexico had just abolished slavery. And these were the slave owners. They were fighting for slavery. And I did not know that. I don't think any American knew it. And, that's something that's really endemic to the American experience, that we refuse to acknowledge the truth. I think it's really part of what Trumpism is about. It's led to that. And it goes back to American origins. Even when Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, which is a great
Right.
sentence. He wasn't referring to women. He wasn't referring to African Americans. He wasn't even including 6 children he had with his slave mistress, Sally Hemings. It
Right.
was a lie. And we don't acknowledge those lies. We don't accept it. And it's one thing I found in all these books is I'm trying to get to the bottom of things and to make them, they should be part of our shared history.
Exactly. And I mean, I want to know. I don't want to just follow an exceptionalist story. I want to know what's true. And I did a 2-year study on colonialism and applying my bite model of authoritarian control to the religious schools and the genocide of indigenous people in what's now Canada, but it's called the First Nations Caring Society. And for me, it's like I want to live in the present, but I want to go to a future where there's planetary survival, and not just, going around, make America great again. Let's follow fantasies that have nothing to do with reality and project them into the future. No, no, no.
Right. If we are to make America great again, we have to acknowledge the truth. And I think that's for individual people as well as the whole country.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, the bottom line is, I mean, I when I wrote The Cult of Trump, I had to tell at least the 50-year story that Trump didn't just appear. Like this has been a lot of wealthy, powerful Christian nationalists, dominionists, neo Nazis, oil barons that don't want regulation working together to dismantle regulations, to dismantle checks and balances with our court system, to combat the liberal college systems, and so I had to tell a longer story that this is a culmination of many decades project.
Right. But it's very hard to penetrate to the other side. And I think you know why, because they're part of a cult.
Right, but the thing is there's a lot of young people who they're fascinated about cult stories, they watch documentaries, they listen to podcasts. I think they would be more open to a more realistic, fact-driven history of the United States, especially, let's start with Reagan, but we could go back to Nixon, and because that's where I was started. I was recruited into a front group of an intelligence organization wanting to promote right-wing anti-communist activities while I was a college student.
Right.
That's my perspective anyway.
Yeah. It's just amazing.
Yeah, so Craig, tell us more of what you think the public needs to know at this moment. We're recording this before the presidential and major elections. We don't know the result. And we probably won't post this till after the elections. But going forward, I'd like to believe we have a future and it isn't just like a parallel to Nazi Germany and Hitler and everything, which is what I'm hearing some people say, because we have states. It's
Right.
not the same thing as Germany was, and we have more powerful information vehicles to not allow total censorship to happen. So what do you talk with us?
Well,
We have a pretty big audience.
regardless of who wins the election or who has won
Yeah.
it, I guess this will be after.
Yes.
It is happening again in some form or another, and we have to fight it. And already you can tell that Elon Musk is playing a big role in this. He's very close with the Russians. It's been reported in the Wall Street Journal. He used a lot of Russian money in taking over Twitter. Twitter has changed enormously since he took it over. So you can see it being skewed to the right quite dramatically. The Washington Post, in fact, had a story on how the top 10 people whose Twitter followings had decreased the most, all of them were major Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Of the top 20 whose followings had gone up the most since Musk took over, 17 were Republicans. And Musk has had a lot of contact with Putin, and he's a surrogate. So it's all, if you replace Bill Casey with Elon Musk, replace Reagan with Trump, it is happening again. It's also, I'm quite concerned about what's going on with Israel. I mean, I would desperately love to see a ceasefire in Gaza, and it ain't going to happen as long as Bibi Netanyahu's there. And Bibi, of course, is very close to Trump. He wants to see Trump reelected. He's been very, very close to Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. This is...
I think he's close to Putin. I can't prove it, but I know there was 1 million Russian Jewish immigrants who went to Israel, who many still listen to RT TV. And, they were raised in an authoritarian cult, the Soviet Union. And so their mindset is all or nothing, black and white, us versus them. And we need to follow the big leader who tells us, what to do.
Right. Well, that was a clear, that was a very clever Russian intelligence operation in a way, in that if you go back to the 70s, and you remember Senator, damn it, I'm sorry, one second.
It's okay.
Henry Jackson, Senator Henry Jackson, Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. He was a Democrat, but he was known as having a muscular foreign policy and was sort of a right-wing Democrat of sorts. And at the time, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Russia, and a lot of Jews wanted to immigrate to the United States. And I interviewed Oleg Kalugin, who was a very head of counterintelligence for the KGB. And he got really excited when I asked him this question. He said, "Oh, that was my idea." I said, "We should send them Jews, but we'll send them our Jews." And the people who went to the United States had been contacted by the KGB, in many ways were sleeper agents. One of them was a man named Semyon Kislin, who started an electronics store in Manhattan that happened to sell hundreds of TV sets to a guy named Donald Trump. And that's the way it worked. And it was going on in Israel as well, because the ones who could get out, the protesters who could get out of Russia already had right of return to Israel, so they didn't have to worry about getting a passport to a new country.
Right. And I read, I don't know where, that the oligarchs who are aligned with Putin all got Israeli passports.
Yes,
I'm not sure where I read that.
Well, it's true. I mean, it was in probably both of my books on Trump.
Oh, maybe you're my source. Yeah. But the linkages, when Trump was first elected, because I've been to Israel, my first wife was an Israeli American. I've spoken to their agencies about cults in Israel. When Trump first got elected, I thought to myself, there's no way Israeli intelligence didn't know that the Russians were involved with electing Donald Trump. Like, how come they didn't say anything or do something was
because
my thought.
they wanted it.
I didn't know that at the time.
Right,
I did put a little section in the Cult of Trump on the Jewish right, and I named Netanyahu as a bad actor,
right,
and Adelson, and the moving of the capital to Jerusalem.
right,
And I'm a Jew, and I've been involved with a Jewish community for over 2 decades. But the current rabbi is a woman and conservatively ordained Orthodox rabbi, and the government of Israel doesn't recognize her as a legitimate rabbi because she's not Orthodox, and that's, to me, how can I align with a country that isn't connected to my values and, the 21st century?
right, right.
At least I'm opining publicly about this. So, wow. So we have a few more minutes left. We've covered a lot of ground. I just want to circle back to the central thesis of your book was that William Casey, campaign manager of Ronald Reagan, was a private citizen, former OSS intelligence agent, went behind the scenes with Israel to negotiate arms shipment to a terrorist country, and told them, but the deal is you got to hold on to the hostages till our guy is elected.
Right.
Did I get that right?
Yes, yes. And the arms shipments, I mean, a lot of it was really high level spy stuff. The way it started out with the Carter administration is there were two Iranian brothers, the Hashemi brothers, Cyrus and Jamshid Hashemi, who immediately after the hostages were taken, they approached the Jimmy Carter State Department and said, "We can help out." And Carter designated them as intermediaries to help resolve the hostage crisis. What he didn't know was they were already agents of Bill Casey. So they were double agents who were betraying Jimmy Carter. Right. And one of the first things they did was, I mean, in terms of shipping arms, is they bought a cargo ship for about $3 million. And they had it take weapons from the port of Eilat in Israel to Bandar Abbas in Iran. And when it arrived in Iran, they would paint the ship, change its name, and sail back under different colors. When it got to Israel, they would do it again. They did that 6 times, and then they sank the ship in the middle of the Mediterranean.
They sank it to get rid of the evidence.
Absolutely. So there's a lot. It's a real spy story in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of crafty stuff like that going on. And it took a long time to ferret it out. I mean, obviously, that's one of the problems. If it takes 33 years to uncover this, that's long after it's actionable. Right. We tried to uncover.
Long after. A lot of people have died, right? You have to go to their papers and their memoirs.
Right. And a lot of the reporting was I was looking for deathbed confessions, and I got a few here and there. But it's very hard. So because it's so hard to resolve it in real time, people have to understand that this has been going on for years and it is happening again.
I think we can wrap up and just say this is a moment of great significance. You've written this book. It tells a many decade story of Republican / right wing / spy crafty, bad actors not telling the public, not being honest to Congress and to any bodies that could regulate them, to manipulate politics.
Right.
Right.
Right. I don't know. I mean, one thing, I don't know if you want to go into it, but the way it's so hard for the press is effectively dead. That's one of the scary things in this, I think. And when I started, I came out of college in a world in which the big stories were the Pentagon Papers, the My Lai massacre, Watergate. And there was a time when it seemed like investigative reporting could, with the right story, change the national conversation, even change the course of history. And those stories did. But back then, newscasters like Walter Cronkite, when they were on TV, they spoke to the entire country. Now everything has been atomized, fragmented, siloed, and you're left with a world that is, Twitter is maybe the best example, or X as it's now called. And unfortunately, that's in the control of Elon Musk, who can, I was told I was shadow banned, and suddenly my Twitter account didn't have nearly the reach it used to have. I'm told that's happening to a lot of people, even to the Washington Post, which has 20 million followers. So that's one thing that's very, very scary, is that it's very increasingly difficult to uncover stuff like this. And when you do, it doesn't reach as wide an audience.
Right. However, there are trustworthy resources and sources that do have Substacks. I have one, maybe you'll get one, where people can go and read real journalists doing real independent, responsible journalism, and not rely on social media, understanding the manipulation and mimetic warfare, etc. And maybe we can, encourage a new generation of independent journalists that have the funding to be able to have a career and tell the stories that the bad actors don't want told.
Well, I certainly hope so.
So, Craig Unger, I don't have a physical copy. I listened to it on Audible. But behind you is a cover, then of Spies. We're going to do a blog, and we'll include this video. We'll put it on the podcast network of the Influence Continuum. And all I can say is thank you for doing the hard work. And it's very appreciated. And I hope we stay in touch. Maybe we'll have some future project together.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind. Only you should control it.